The global landscape of migration, economic governance, and international relations is undergoing significant shifts, challenging long-standing power structures and raising questions about equity and representation. This complex interplay of facts reshapes the world order and prompts calls for recall across various international institutions. The current approach to mitigation and refugee protection reveals stark inconsistency in how different groups are treated. Some populations receive more favorable terms, while others face stricter restrictions. These restrictions are often based on culture or religious similarities rather than consistent humanitarian principles. This disparity is becoming increasingly apparent. Ongoing conflict, climate change, and economic pressures, migration from the global south. As these migration trends continue, the debate over their inconsistency will likely intensify. There is growing pressure on the Europe and global community to align their declared humanitarian principles with consistent applications. This calls for a more equitable and uniform approach to those fleeing danger, regardless of their origin or their background. The IMF representation. IMF governance structure has long been a point of contention, particularly regarding the underrepresentation of emerging economies in decision-making voices. Despite some updates, the United States and European Union together hold half of the IMF's votes. In the early 2020s, Western aligned countries maintained more than 60% of the IMF voting power, giving them a disproportionate influence over policy, loans, conditions, and planning. The United States alone holds 16% of the voting power, effectively granting it a veto power over measures requiring an 85% supermajority. This voting structure starkly contrasts with the changing global economic landscape. For instance, China's GDP exceeds 18 trillion by 2020, yet its voting power remains limited to below 7%, significantly mismatched with its actual economic size. This disparity has fueled calls for change, particularly from the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The BRICS nations have been advocating for rebalancing at G20 meeting. The BRICS conference pushing for revised quotas that recognize shifting economic power and amplifying developing world viewpoints. This push for reform extends beyond the IMF to other international financial institutions. In response to the slow pace of the reform in the traditional IFIS, BRICS nations have taken steps to create alternative financial mechanisms. The new Development Bank, NDB, launched by the BRICS in 2014, provides alternative financing aligned with emerging economies' priorities. While the NDB and similar entities like the Asian Infrastructural Investment Bank have diversified global funding options, their growth has highlights that slow progress of the traditional IFIS, incorporating new power centers. Some Western officials acknowledge that more equitable governance model would enhance the credibility and effectiveness of the institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. However, entrenched political barriers and institutional inertia continues to implode significant changes. Critics warn that these institutions may lose relevance without genuine reform in an increasingly multipolar world. Global power structures accelerate these governance. Russia, sidelined by sanctions, followed its 2022 invasion of Ukraine, relies more on the BRICS group for both diplomatic and economic operations. China's position on issues like Hong Kong, Xpeng, or South China Sea further deepen global divisions. The BRICS collective effort challenges what they view as a Western dominance international oversight. This extends to debates over climate and trade policies, while BRICS nations argue that the Western-led climate strategies impose a strict emissions reduction on countries still developing industrial India, for example, contends that their fair climate action requires financial technology assistance. To address these long-standing imbalances, various proposals have gained momentum. One, expanding the UN Security Council to include permanent seats for rising powers like India and Brazil. Two, strengthening regional blocs such as ASEAN and Africa Union and Mercosur to distribute influence more evenly. Three, to increase non-Western influences, develop new coalitions like BRICS Plus, potentially including nations like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. As BRIC broadens its influence, demands for systematic reform become louder. If Western nations resist significant changes, the BRICS and its allies may develop a parallel framework to counter the Western-led order. Although internal disagreements exist among BRICS members, the future shape of global governance may depend on the ability to use a coherent, practical vision, far more inclusive international system. In the coming years, traditional international situations like continue to be pressured to reform and adapt to changing global power dynamics. The outcome of these struggles for representation influences will shape the future of international cooperation, economic governance, and geopolitical relations for decades to come. Please leave a comment below so we can continue the conversation. Thanks for watching.